Speaker, there are many people who are wondering in the nation exactly what it was that we were doing up here a couple of weeks ago as we were talking about amendments to cut the budget, amendments to increase the budget. And for myself, I like to keep it in very narrow terms. I like to get it as simple as possible. And so we went across the district last week, had town hall meetings, trying to explain to people exactly the situation that we're facing here in the country. And I've got a chart here which is very instrumental in helping me to visualize what's going on, and basically this chart is one which shows that we're spending $3.5 trillion at the current moment, and we're taking in $2.2 trillion, and that begins to give the basic understanding of where we are. Now, if a local family were in this position, they would be maybe spending $3,500 a month and bringing in $2,200 a month. And their banker would not be pleased with that. Their banker would say, well, we probably need to do better, especially if they were borrowing money every month. And we are borrowing money every month to work here, and so our government is just as stressed with the debt and with this imbalance in spending and imbalance in revenues that a family would be. Now, our banker in this country is used to Americans saved and they bought treasury bills. That's how we would finance our government. But Americans across the country basically don't save anymore. And so we have to find other people who buy our treasury bills, and that's the Chinese government. So China is our borrower of record, our lender of record, and so we would watch what the Chinese have said in the past couple of months, in the past couple of years. And a couple of times China has said we're not going to buy any more of the treasury bills from the United States government. At one point they said we'll buy South Korean treasury bills, meaning the South Korean government was a better bet than the U.S. government. And so our banker has been giving us signs that we're concerned. We're concerned about this economic health of your country because they see that we cannot long continue. Now, for myself, I've gone ahead and done the mathematics that if you are spending 3.5, you're bringing in 2.2, while you are running a deficit of $1.3 trillion every year. Now, that's a deficit as long as it's unaccounted for, as long as it hasn't been spent. But the moment that the money spends, then it goes into the debt barrel, and that's the top small barrel, and we have a debt of approximately $15 trillion, might be a little bit less. To put that in perspective, that debt barrel began to build in the early days of our history, and we accumulated up to $5 trillion worth of debt to the second President Bush, George W. Bush. And during his term, we increased that debt from 5 to basically 10. So a very rapid escalation of debt accumulation during the second Bush years. But then, under President Obama, then we have seen an acceleration even faster. So that we've already added almost another $5 trillion in debt in 2.5 years under President Obama, and we're on track to maybe add another 6 or 7, maybe 8 in the next 2 years. This 1.3 deficit for this coming year, that was last year. This coming year, that number becomes 1.6 trillion. So you can see that the gap between what we're bringing in and what we're spending is absolutely increasing rather than decreasing. Now, to put this in a bigger perspective, the last year of President Bush, the deficit was about $200 billion. So instead of 1.3, it was about 0.2. If we round it off to 0.3, you could see that almost immediately under President Obama, that we increased our deficit. That is, we increased these outlays by almost $1 trillion, so that our economic condition is worsening very rapidly. Now, the unsettling piece is if you look at the $15 trillion in the top debt barrel, and then you look at the revenues that we're bringing in from the government, you say, well, we could pay off 7 or 8 years. If we weren't spending a thing, we could pay off for 7 or 8 years and still not have quite all of our debt paid off. But then the alarming piece is this fiscal gap at the bottom. That is Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And when we consider those elements, then we're looking at a $202 trillion deficit, a debt that we owe. Those are mandated spending programs that we're not going to turn off. And so we can already understand that we would pay almost 100 years if we were only getting $2.2 trillion into paying off this fiscal gap that we experience here. Now, over in the far right corner of the chart, we see now a graph, and the thing about graphs is they go on in time. This bottom line, the horizontal line, is actually years, and the vertical line then is representative of the average income, per capita income, that we as Americans have had through our history. And so I ask our listeners always, are you doing better than your parents did? And almost always the answer is yes. I make more money than my parents did, and I myself made more money than my parents did. And that's shown on this chart, that every year the chart has been increasing as we go through time. The numbers increase, and so it shows that. But then we see that the chart levels off and starts down. And so when I ask people right now, are your children going to live better than you? Are your children going to have more income than you did? And very few people in a room will raise their hand. That's because they see that the economic condition of the world is getting worse, not better, and that worsening condition is based simply on these factors right here. There's nothing in the world economies that would not improve if we didn't solve these problems, and so it does not have to be. We could continue that growth curve forever. So we're right now at the point where the curve flattens off and moves down into a lower category, but at the very tip of that curve is a red dot, and then the curve stops. And discerning people would say, well, I thought graphs just continue. You draw them on out through infinity. Well, you do, except this chart stops. And this chart stops because our economy literally shows both Office of Management and Budget, the White House, and the CBO, that's the congressional arm. So both the White House and the Congress both show the same chart, that our economies simply cease to function about 2037. Now, for the people who are younger than myself, that's in your lifetimes. I may not see that, but my children and grandchildren will see this point where our economy quits. That's what happened in the Soviet Union. President Reagan believed that if he simply increased our spending enough on arms, that he could cause them to continue to invest more spending on arms. They would not be able to increase the revenues. They would have this gap right here. Their deficits would increase, their debt would increase, and eventually the system would implode. It would collapse on itself, and that's what's happening in our economy in 2037. So at this particular point in our time, we have to stop and say, we can't continue this. We must begin to do differently. And that's what the House was doing last week. Now, many in the country have said, oh, they're draconian cuts. We should not have done that. You shouldn't have cut that deeply. And others are saying you should have cut more. So let's evaluate that very briefly. And we cut basically about $60 billion out of the budget. We cut it out of the continuing resolution a couple of weeks ago when we passed that bill. And so what does $60 billion mean in this chart? $60 billion would mean that you change this number from 3.5 to 3.44. And we're still faced with only the 2.2 here in revenues to the country. And I would ask every listener in the audience, is that significant? Is it draconian? And if you think it's draconian, would your banker think it's draconian? And almost everyone laughs if I ask them, if you were spending $3,500 a month, bringing in $2,200 a month, and you went to your banker, would your banker think that you made significant cuts if you cut from $3,500 to $3,440? And most people laugh and say, my banker wouldn't talk to me if I only cut that much. And so I put it into that context, that we did not do significant cuts, and yet many of the people here in Washington are wailing and weeping and gnashing of teeth, those sorts of things, that catastrophe just awaits us because we cut spending by 0.06. Myself, I don't think so. I think that the looming economic crisis in 2037 is the more compelling point, that our economy simply will cease to function out in that range. And again, you can go online and look at CBO or OMB to find that chart. That's where we pulled it out. And so take a look at it. But the important thing is to understand that no company, my wife and I ran a small company, and no company ever found itself in fiscal straits like this and cured it simply by cutting spending. I don't think that it's possible for us to cut spending from 3.5 to 2.2. As a business person, it does not ring true. It doesn't seem like that we can cut that much. And so if we can't cut that much spending, you have to say, well, then how do we get the 2.2 to move toward the 3.5? If we can't cut spending enough, then how do we grow the revenues? Now, some people will say, well, we should raise taxes. That should be, they would say we should raise taxes. And then you should have to ask, well, what's the outcome of raising taxes? The first thing is to understand that there's a basic economic truth, that tax increases will kill jobs. And so if we want to make this number smaller, just increase taxes, and we actually increase the difference. We increase our deficit because this number actually gets smaller at that point. If we want to solve the problem that we're facing now, there's only one way to go, and that is economic growth. We need to create jobs. If we have to create jobs, then we must evaluate the ways that we're not creating jobs today. The two greatest threats to job creation.
The gentleman will suspend temporarily. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker, I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed without amendment H.R. 662, cited as the Surface Transportation Extension Act of 2011.
Gentleman from New Mexico may proceed.
We resume our discussion talking about how we would create these two numbers to come together. That would be a balanced budget. And again, I would repeat that it is very difficult for us to cut enough spending to reach balance, that my idea is that we must increase the number of jobs. As we bring people into the workforce, we're simultaneously accomplishing two things. We're causing this number to go up as people pay taxes that were previously unemployed. But then we're also bringing people off of unemployment, welfare, and government assistance, and so we're lowering this number toward this one as we increase that one. The actuarial tables show us that at about 3.5% rate of growth, that we can actually begin to move towards balance. These long-term numbers begin to clear up significantly just by creating jobs in the growth rate of about 3.5%. Well, then the next question would be, can we create jobs in 3.5%? Well, that's exactly what we've averaged for over 70 years. It's well established that we can do it. Right now, our economic growth is in the 1 to 2% range, so it means that we almost have to double our rate of growth, and that would be possible if we did two basic things. Number one, if we lowered taxes, and tax breaks create jobs, tax decreases create jobs, tax increases kill jobs, and so then the second aspect of creating jobs would be to lower the regulations. Now, I have many people that react in horror, and when I say we should lower regulations, they immediately claim you would go to zero regulation. I don't mean that at all. I simply mean that we are regulating our jobs out of existence. Companies are finding it easier to go to another country and operate rather than operate here. The regulations are so extreme. One way that we're regulating companies out of existence is through our lending right now. We passed the Dodd-Frank bill, which puts new requirements on banks, and so the bankers in my district in southern New Mexico have been calling recently saying that we used to, under the previous accounting methods and the previous reporting methods, would simply get written up if we made a mistake on a loan package. Today, we're told that we could get a $50,000 fine. So they then are skeptical and reticent to lend money to small businesses and to people buying homes because they stand to lose more on the loan by one typographical error, one exception than they can make. And so that then has the formal process that a young family, a young couple in Socorro, New Mexico, have recently graduated from New Mexico Tech in that area. They both are employed, both have degrees, both have good paying jobs, and yet the bank says, well, you know, we just don't want to lend money because it might turn out to be a bad loan, and we could lose our bank over one bad loan, or we could get a $50,000 penalty over a mistake in the loan application. It's just too tough. That means the regulations have been so high that the businesses are saying, well, we would rather stay on the sidelines, which is what's happening nationwide. So we're being told that if the banks would simply loan money, that everything would be fixed. And it's a lot true. Construction would start back, houses would start back, real estate agents would start back. Everyone would start, except it is